الرحمن الرحيم. To continue مختصر تبيان في آداب حملة القرآن. We're now where Imam al-Nawawi, he mentions, rahimahullah, that the scholars, may Allah have mercy upon them, said it is preferred to read in the order of the Mus'haf. To read the surahs in the order of the Mus'haf. So he reads Fatiha, then Al-Baqarah, then Ali Imran, and then An-Nisa, until he finishes with the surah, Surah An-Nas, Qul a'udhu bi Rabbin Nas. So he reads in this order. Whether he is reading in the prayer or outside of it. Also, it is recommended if he reads a surah, that he reads the surah next after it. So, for example, you read Surah Baqarah, you're going to read Ali Imran next. Until he reads or he reaches Qul a'udhu bi Rabbin Nas. If he reads in the second rak'ah from Surah Al-Baqarah, if he reads, he says if he reads in the first rak'ah, Qul a'udhu bi Rabbin Nas, based on this opinion, when you go to the second rak'ah, what will you read? Al-Baqarah. You read Al-Baqarah, a portion of Al-Baqarah. This is what he's mentioning here. And the proof for that is that the order of the Qur'an is due to a wisdom. And it is befitting to preserve that except when evidence has come with an exception, such as the morning prayer on the day of Jum'ah. What do you read on the morning prayer on the day of Jum'ah? What's the sunnah to read on Jum'ah in Salat al-Fajr? Surah Sajda and Al-Insan. Surah Sajda and Al-Insan. So here he's saying this is an exception. Why? Because Al-Insan doesn't come after Surah Sajda. Al-Insan doesn't come after Surah Sajda. Also in the Eid prayer, he says you read Surah Al-Qaf and Iqtarabat as-Sa'ah. And other than that, from that which will come in the 8th chapter, inshaAllah. And then he says, if he opposes the order and reads a surah, then reads one before it, or opposes the order by reading that which is before it and not the one after it, then it is allowed. But it is leaving off that which is better. As for reading the surah from the ending to the beginning, meaning backwards, then the scholars agree that it is not allowed. To read a surah backwards is not allowed. For it gets rid of the sum of the miracles of the surah and wisdom of the order. As for teaching the children from the last parts of the Mus'haf to the beginning, then that is good and it is not from this affair. What does that mean? The children, it's allowed for you to teach them from Juz Amma backwards or from Juz Tabarak backwards. That is allowed. There's no problem with that. Now to continue with this, as for reading the Qur'an in order, then it does come from the Prophet ﷺ, the hadith of Hudayfa ibn Yaman radiallahu anhu, Sahih Muslim, that the Prophet ﷺ, he read in the night prayer, Al-Baqarah, then An-Nisa, and then Ali Imran. From this, the scholars, they get that it's permissible to break the order of the Mus'haf when reading in the Salah or outside the Salah. And that is not a must to follow the order of the surahs. Al-Qadi Iyad, he said there is no differing, that it is allowed for the one praying to read in the second rak'ah a surah which is before the one he read in the first one. He said there's no difference regarding this. That is allowed. But here, I know it was mentioned that it is better not to do so. But is it allowed? Yes, it's allowed. Now, some of the Salaf, though, they dislike that. That is, dislike not following the order of the Mus'haf, but the evidence is show otherwise. What's the evidence? Hadith of Hudayfa. The Prophet read Baqarah, then An-Nisa, then Ali Imran. He didn't follow the order of the Mus'haf. This shows it's permissible. As for reading the surah backwards, then it is not allowed because every single verse in the surah is tawfiqi. It is tawqifi. What does tawqifi mean? It's restricted. It's evidence for it. Every ayah in the surah is put there in order by way of tawqif, by way of an evidence. That it is a must to read every ayah in order. It's not allowed to read the surah backwards. The evidence for that is, it comes in Bukhari from Ibn Abi Mulaika, that he said, Ibn Zubayr said to Uthman, this ayah, which is in Baqarah, وَالَّذِينَ يَتَوَفَّوْنَ مِنْكُمْ وَيَذَرُونَ أَزْوَاجًا إِلَى قَوْلِ غَيْرِ إِخْرَاجٍ قَدْ نَسَخَتْهَا الْأُخْرَى, that it was abrogated. فَلِمَ تَكْتُبُهَا, then why are you writing it? قَالْ تَدَعُهَا يَا ابْنَ أَخِي لَا أُغَيْرِ الشَّيْء مِنْهُ مِنْ مَكَانِهِ. He said, leave it, my nephew, I will never change anything from its right place. This means that the ayahs are put in its right place, and this is how the Prophet recited it. And it's not allowed to change ayahs from, we are organized the ayahs. As for the surahs, then you can read one before it, one after it, but the surahs itself, the ayahs in it, you cannot change the order of that. That order is not allowed to change. And this is without any differing. As Zarkashi mentioned, that there's no difference regarding this. Also, it is not why the Qur'an was sent down. The Qur'an was sent down to tadabbur ayat. Not for you to play around the Qur'an, read one surah from the back from backwards to try to test your memory. That's not what the surah was sent down for. Rather is to ponder over it and read and contemplate, as Al-Qurtubi mentioned, that it's not allowed to read a surah backwards. Not for practicing memorization, not for any other reason. Rather, the surah must be read in order of the ayahs. Then he says, reading from the Mus'haf is better than reading from memory, because it gathers between reading and looking in the Mus'haf. And it is an act of worship itself, meaning looking in the Mus'haf. As our companions and the Salaf said. Who is his companions? When I know he mentions Ashabuna. Who is his companions? The Shafi'is. The Shafi'is, because Imam al-Nawawi was Shafi'i. So when he says they are companions, the Salaf said. And I do not see any differing in that. Perhaps they intended that in regards to the one whose khushu' will be the same. And being present, whether reading from the Mus'haf or from memory. As for the one whose khushu' and pondering increases in reading from memory, then that is better for him. So here the scholars, they differed. Is it better you look into the Mus'haf and read the Qur'an? Or that you read from your memory? Imam Ibn Bazi says, if reading from memory has more khushu', then read from your memory. But if reading from the Mus'haf you have more khushu', then read from the Mus'haf. If everyone is different when it comes to which one is better for him and his contemplation of the Qur'an. But that should be, a point should be mentioned, that a person should look into the Mus'haf often. It comes with an authentic chain from Ibn Mas'ud, Adimu an-nadhar fil Mus'haf. Adimu an-nadhar fil Mus'haf. Always look into the Mus'haf. Adimu, always look into the Mus'haf. Adimu an-nadhar fil Mus'haf, and it's authentic, reported by Ibn Abi Shayba in his Musannaf. Then he mentions it's recommended for a group to gather together to read. That is recommended for a group to gather together and read. And the virtue of them gathering for that, those who attend from those who are reading or listening and attending. As for the one who has a reason for that, then the one who has a reason for this gathering, the one who was the reason for bringing this gathering about, then his reward is great. And from those who rush in regarding sincerity towards the Book of Allah, and establishing a right from its right, and all of this is affirmed by evidences. We're going to get to what he means by gathering together for reading the Qur'an. For the Prophet ﷺ said, مَجْتَمَعَ قَوْمٌ فِي بَيْتٍ بُيُوتِ اللَّهِ. What's the rest of the hadith? مَجْتَمَعَ قَوْمٌ فِي بَيْتٍ بُيُوتِ اللَّهِ يَتْلُونَ كِتَابَ اللَّهِ وَيَتَدَارَسُونَ بَيْنَهُمْ إِلَّا نَزَلَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ السَّكِينَةُ وَغَشِيَتْهُمْ الرَّحْمَةُ وَحَفَّتْهُمُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ وَذَكَرَهُمُ اللَّهُ فِي مَنْ عِنْدَهُ. The Prophet said, no people gather in the house from the house of Allah. وَيَتَدَارَسُونَ بَيْنَهُمْ, when they study the Qur'an amongst themselves, except that the mercy of Allah, or the tranquility descends on them. And the mercy of Allah covers them. And the angels, they surround them. And Allah mentions them amongst those with Him. So then I know He mentions, I mentioned in At-Tibyan a number of narrations and reports in this chapter. What is At-Tibyan? When He says, I mentioned At-Tibyan, what is He referring to? The full version of this book. We're studying the Mukhtasar, the summarized version. He mentioned the full version, different narrations regarding this chapter. He says, gathering regarding the Qur'an, there's two good ways of reading in a group. Number one, all of them read at once. All of them read at once with one voice. This was intended. Number two, some of them read a juz, then they listen, and the next group reads the next juz. And like this, it's called al-idara. That one group reads a certain portion, then they remain silent, then the second group reads a portion, and they remain silent, they keep going like this. What Nawawi is mentioning here is that it is recommended to read the Qur'an in congregation with one voice. That you read together, all together with one voice. This is what Nawawi is mentioning here. And he uses evidence, the generality of the different evidences that have come, like this one. يَتْلُونَ كِتَابَ اللَّهِ يَتَدَارَسُونَ بَيْنَهُمْ. They recite the Qur'an and they study amongst themselves. And this is the stance of majority of the scholars, that they say this is recommended, to sit down and read the Qur'an all together at once with one voice. But other scholars, they said, no, this is not allowed. And they said it shouldn't be done like this. They said you shouldn't sit down and read Qur'an all with one voice. And they said that this is an innovation. At-Turtushi, in his book Al-Hawadith wal-Bid'a, he mentioned, replying to those who allow it, he said, what is the answer of those narrations that allow or mention this reading Qur'an together? He says the answer is that these narrations necessitate the permissibility to gather for reading of the Qur'an, based on the meaning of a class for it, learning and reviewing, and that is done how? By a student reading to the teacher, or the teacher reading to the student, or if they are equals in knowledge, they read to one another in a study or review. This is how learning and studying is done without reading all at once. So At-Turtushi is mentioning that it's not from the Sunnah to read all at once. Shaykh Albani went further. Shaykh Albani said this reading all at once in one voice, he says a bid'ah. He says it's innovation and is not allowed and not reported from the Prophet ﷺ nor any of the Sahaba, that they read together the Qur'an all at once. Similarly, Taqiyuddin al-Hilali also mentions it's not allowed to read it all at once. Now, they reply to the narrations that are general. They say, one, that many of the narrations from the Salaf, like the narration of Abu Darda, that he said him and a group would study the Qur'an together all with one voice, they say that is weak. It's not authentic to Abu Darda. Also, they say that we have no evidence that the Sahaba and the Prophet did this, because we don't have any evidence, and the hadith that they're mentioning actually mean to study the Qur'an together. Then they say it's not allowed. Also, from the other evidence, they say that when you hear the Qur'an, what are you supposed to do? What's the ayah? What's that? وَإِذَا قُرِئَ الْقُرْآنُ فَاسْتَمِعُوا لَهُ وَأَنصِتُوا لَعَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ. When the Qur'an is recited, listen attentively and remain quiet. They say if everyone's reading together with one voice, there's no silence here. No one's paying attention to the Qur'an. Everyone's just reading one voice, and it's just one voice being read, and no one's listening. This is their stance. Shaykh al-Uthaymeen and other scholars, they go into detail regarding this affair, and they say reading in one voice for teaching, there's no problem. Now pay attention here. He says reading in one voice for teaching, there's no problem. Whereas a teacher reads a verse, then the students together they follow him. As you guys are doing the hadith class, where one person reads the hadith, or you guys doing a line of poetry, one person read it, and then the rest of you read it together. That is what it intends. That they say is allowed. Shaykh al-Uthaymeen said that is allowed. But if it is done by way of worship, then that is an innovation. In some countries, they sit down between Maghrib and Isha, for example, and they start reading the Qur'an all in one voice together. And they do this as a form of ibadah. This is an innovation. They're not doing it by way of ta'aleem, teaching and learning. They're doing as ibadah, sitting after between Maghrib and Isha to read the Qur'an together in one voice. This is an innovation. It's not allowed. But then he mentions as well that this should be done as long as there's no harm. What are some of the harms that may be caused by doing this? Number one, that if everyone is reading in one voice and it causes a disturbance in the masjid, it shouldn't be done. That says other people in the masjid, and you are doing this in the masjid and causing disturbance to others, you shouldn't do it like this. Nor should be done as some of the Sufis they do, as it becomes a form of chanting. Also from the harms is that some people, when they follow this way, they get so accustomed to doing it together that they don't read the Qur'an alone. It becomes a fitna for them. That if they're not together, not reading the Qur'an together, they won't read the Qur'an alone. So if these harms are present, then Shaykh al-Uthaymeen says, don't do it like this. But generally for teaching, it is allowed. Now Abdullah, the daughter of Imam Muqbil, she mentioned that it used to be done in Dammaj like this. They used to sit together, that the teacher would read the ayah, and then the students would repeat all together in one voice. Until some of the students of Shaykh Muqbil, they said to him, this is a bid'ah. And so they stopped it. But later on, when it was researched by the students in Dammaj, they returned to doing it like this. So from this we understand 4 points. Number one, reading the Qur'an and studying with one another is allowed. There's no question about that. Reading the Qur'an and studying with one another is allowed. What's the proof of that? How did Jibreel alayhi salam used to present the Qur'an to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? And you know how Jibreel used to present the Qur'an to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? He used to recite it in front of him. And then what the Prophet would do? Jibreel remained silent, and the Prophet would recite what he recited. That is allowed. That kind of teaching, which is generally known amongst us, is allowed. Now, for one to read the Qur'an whilst the rest listen. Let's say someone right now got up and read the Qur'an, and the rest of us listen. Is that allowed? That's allowed. For someone to read the Qur'an and the rest of us listen, there's no problem with that. The third one is to read as a group. This is where we're talking about this differing. If it is done for learning and teaching, no problem with it. But if it is done as a form of worship, then this is not allowed. Shaykh Salih al-Fawzan, he was asked about this. He said if they read it together by way of learning, then no problem with that. As if it is a way from the ways, for this is a way from the ways of learning. But if it is an act of worship, then this is innovation. Like we mentioned, if someone's going to come today and say, every Jum'ah, for example, we're going to come to the masjid, 20 of us, we're going to sit between Maghrib and Isha, we're not going to recite the Qur'an in one voice, this is a bid'ah. It's not something that should be done. Similarly, Najah Da'ima, they mentioned this as well. And similarly, Shaykh Abdul Muhsin al-Abbad, he mentioned this as well, that it should be avoided reading the Qur'an with one voice as an act of worship and is not allowed. As for reading alone, where one reads and the other listens, then we mentioned this is known from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. This is how Jibril presented the Qur'an to the Prophet ﷺ. You read the verse, or you read, and then the Prophet will repeat after him. And this is allowed also because the hadith in Mas'ud radiallahu anh, that he read the Qur'an to the Prophet ﷺ and the Prophet was listening. Shaykh al-Islam, he mentioned that one person reciting whilst the rest listen, then it is not disliked without any differing. And it's recommended, and is what the Sahaba used to do. For one person to read the Qur'an and the rest listen, there's no problem with that. And it's important, for you find some of the people back home in other areas, they'll sit down and they make it a form of ibadah. They all read the Qur'an together with one voice. And if you don't join them in that, they think you're belittling the Qur'an. And this in reality, they're doing a bid'ah that has been made seem beautiful to them, doing it like this. Al-idara. Then he says al-idara. What is al-idara? Is where a group reads, for example, a juz, or other than that, and there's another group, they remain silent. Once the first group is done reading their juz, or whatever portion of Qur'an they have, the second group, they pick up from where they stopped. The second group, they pick up from where they stopped. And then they continue. And then when they stop, the group that remains silent now continues on like this, and they keep doing this. And this helps with memorization, helps with review, and like this. Shaykh al-Islam Taymiyyah rahimahullah said that this is considered something good with most of the scholars. Most of the scholars, they consider this to be something good. Also, let's say someone doesn't pick up from where he stopped. So you read your portion, now the second group is going to read their own portion. Then that is also allowed, and there's nothing wrong with that. So these forms of reading the Qur'an like this is allowed according to the scholars. For that reason, it's important for us to know how the scholars used to teach the Qur'an and how the student should learn the Qur'an. Because some of the ways that these people do, as I mentioned, is not something which is suitable or not allowed. Then he says, the chapter of when the Qurra, they gather together. Chapter when the Qurra, they gather together. And the manners which they are in need of in that gathering. And he says there are many. But he says we're going to mention or indicate towards some of them and clarify that which clarify the rest as well. He says all of the manners of a qari, of a reciter alone, is also the manners of when they're together. So all the manners that a reciter has when he's alone reciting, they also apply when they're reciting together. And we increase on that different kind of manners, which some of the people who are ignorant, they're easygoing regarding. From that is that when they are reciting, they shouldn't laugh. When you're in a group and you're reciting Qur'an, there shouldn't be laughter. You find this in some of the youth and the kids when they're teaching Qur'an, there's a group on the side, they're laughing. They should be taught that this is not allowed and not suitable in a sitting of Qur'an. Nor there should be playing around. Nor there should be any kind of speaking and conversing when the Qur'an is being recited in that gathering. When they're reciting the Qur'an, there shouldn't be any conversing. Except if there is speech which is needed, which there is a must to say, then you say it. From that also is a person shouldn't play with his hands too much in the class of the Qur'an. Also, a person shouldn't be looking around too much where it distracts him. Also, a person shouldn't have his mind all over the place. His mind shouldn't be all over the place when reading the Qur'an. And what is worse than that is that a person is sitting in a Qur'an class and looking at that which Allah has made haram upon him. Such as looking at Al-Amrad. What is Al-Amrad? Anyone know Al-Amrad is? Al-Amrad is those young boys that don't have, those young boys that that people may fall into fitna because of them. The scholars, they mention, like Shaykh Al-Hajuri, he mentions that if it is a Qur'an class, there's no problem with teaching these kind of boys. There's no problem with teaching, because the ad of the Muslims is that they used to teach these kind of boys. And it's not a fitna. But if a person finds that he's going to be tried by this young little boy, he's not allowed to teach him. And what is worse than that, as Shaykh al-Islam Taymiyyah mentioned, that it's not allowed for you to hug these boys. It's not allowed for you to kiss these boys in a cheek, or even if the parents allowed, he says, it's not allowed. Because a person is not allowed to do this, and this is only allowed for the father and the brothers. And yes, it has become a fitna for some people. It's become a trial for some people that they became trialed by these young little boys. And for that reason, the scholars, they authored regarding it, from them Al-Ajurri, and them, they warned from these kind of fitnas. A person is not allowed for him to look at these boys and look at them in a haram way. Whether it is by way of desires or other than it. You cannot look at these boys like that. If you are teaching them Qur'an, teach them Qur'an. But if you're going to be trialed by these young boys, it's not allowed for you to teach them. And what is, if they're not allowed to teach young boys because you may be trialed by them, then min bab al-awla, it's not allowed for men to teach young girls because they'll be trialed even more. and this is a fitna that occurs in many of the Qur'an classes, that a grown man is teaching young little girls, and he's being trialed by them, and they're beautifying their voices to him, and he's teaching them without any kind of barrier. And she is beautifying her voice, and at times you might even be alone with her. And you find that these people, if you say this is haram, you cannot do this, they say, but it's just Qur'an. How can someone become trialed by way of Qur'an? Well, read the stories before you. They became trialed by reading the Qur'an and by knowledge. They became trialed by way of these young boys and by way of these young girls. And you'll find that some of these people that teach Qur'an to these young girls, what ends up happening later on? He marries that student. Never heard a story like that? He ends up marrying the student. How did he find out the student was like that? Because you had fitna by way of her. You was trialed by way of her. So it's not allowed to do this. And then also he says, even if you feel that you're safe from fitna, or you are not safe, or you don't feel you're safe from it, then he says you shouldn't do this. And this is the correct madhab with the scholars, that you shouldn't teach these kind of young boys, wal amrad, who don't have any beard growing or any facial hair growing on them, and they look like young girls. Then he says, وَقَدْ نَسَّ عَلَى تَحْرِيمِ الْإِمَامِ الشَّافِعِي. Imam al-Shafi'i said that's haram. وَمَنْ لَا يُحْصَى مِنَ الْعُلَمَاءِ. And many scholars, he said it's not allowed. Allah says, كُلِّ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ وَيَحْفَظُوا فُرُوجَهُمْ. Because it comes in the meaning of women. These young boys, they look like young girls. بَلْ كَثِيرٌ مِنْهُمْ أَحْسَنُ مِنْ كَثِيرٍ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ. He says some of these young boys may be a fitna for some men, where they think they look better than some of these women. And by way of that, they become easygoing with them. They become easygoing them. In a way, they will not become easygoing women. They say, it's just a young boy, he plays around with them, he plays around with them, he hugs them, and he does stuff like that, and it becomes a trial for him. And this is something that's occurred. It is something that's occurred in our community, in Toronto, in other areas it's occurred. It's not something that's far-fetched. Some women, they say, but it's just a young boy, what's wrong with that? It has occurred. It's a fitna for some people. It's a trial. If it's a trial for those kind of individuals, it's not allowed for them to teach these young boys. It's not allowed for them to teach young boys, and a parent should be aware of who is teaching their young child. It's important that a parent is aware of who is teaching his young child. And he says the statements of the Salaf I've mentioned to stay away from that. And he says, no, that is obligatory upon anyone or everyone that attends a sitting of the Qur'an or recitation, that he rejects any kind of evil that he sees. He rejects it first with his hand. If he's not able to do so, then with his tongue. And if he's not able to do so, then with his heart. Where did he get that from? Where did you get this from? If you want to reject the evil, you reject it with your hand. مَنْ رَأَى مِنْكُمْ مُنْكَرًا فَلْيُغَيِّرْهُ بِيَدِهِ. Whoever sees the evil, change it with your hand. فَإِنْ لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِلِسَانِهِ. If you cannot do it with your hand, you change it with your tongue. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِقَلْبِهِ وَذَلِكَ أَضْعَفُ الْإِيمَانِ. Not do so, then do it with your heart, and that's the lowest form of iman. So with this much, we'll stop inshallah. And continue in 2 weeks, since next week is the conference. If there's any quick question, we'll take now. If not, I'll continue. Yes.